In this segment on the white matter of cerebrum, let us study the projection fibers. Projection fibers, as defined in the earlier segment, are basically the fibers which connect cerebral hemisphere with some subcortical center. That subcortical center may be diencephalon, brainstem, cerebellum, or spinal cord. The projection fibers may include ascending fibers or corticopetal fibers, or descending fibers or corticofugal fibers. The major collection of the projection fibers is what forms the internal capsule. The other collections of projection fibers include medial forebrain bundle and fornix. Now let us first identify some of the structures shown in this picture. It's a coronal section showing caudate nucleus, thalamus, and this is the lentiform nucleus made up of lateral part known as putamen, medial part known as globus pallidus. Now between these three structures, that is caudate nucleus and thalamus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally, there is a band of white matter. Now that band of white matter is what is known as internal capsule. So if you see this area, in the upper part, the fibers which are reaching the cortex or coming down from the cortex, they will form what is known as corona radiata, because these fibers are radiating towards the cortical area. And as they descend down, they form a compact fiber bundle. That is what is the internal capsule. Now, internal capsule also sends some of the fibers below the lentiform nucleus. That part is known as sublentiform part. If you look at this internal capsule at or above the level of thalamus, it contains many more fibers, because the major input and major output from the internal capsule is to the thalamus. But if you see the internal capsule below this level, that is if you see these fibers at the level of crus cerebri, the fiber number has come down quite a bit, because most of the fibers have exhausted at the level of thalamus. Now let us see the same internal capsule as it is seen in the horizontal section of the cerebral hemispheres. Here again, let us first identify some of the structures. This is the head of the caudate nucleus, this is the thalamus, and more laterally we have the lentiform nucleus. Now between these three structures, we know that there is the internal capsule, but see that now the internal capsule has taken a V-shaped arrangement. So let us see the different parts of internal capsule. Firstly, between the head of the caudate nucleus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally, we have the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Then between the thalamus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally, we have the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Now between this anterior limb and posterior limb, at the junction which forms the apex of the V, we have genu of the internal capsule. Now starting from the posterior end, running behind the lentiform nucleus towards the occipital pole, we have the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. And running from the posterior end, below the lentiform nucleus, we have the sublentiform part of the internal capsule, which was shown in the earlier picture. So these are the 5 parts of internal capsule. Anterior limb between the head of the caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus. Posterior limb between the thalamus medially and lentiform nucleus laterally. Genu at the junction between anterior and posterior limb. Retrolentiform part behind the lentiform nucleus, as the name suggests, and sublentiform part below the lentiform nucleus, as the name suggests. Now coming to the blood supply of of internal capsule. Anterior limb, genu and posterior limb, they are running downwards. So they are divided into an upper part and a lower part. Sublentiform part and retrolentiform parts are not divided into upper and lower parts. So first let us identify what are the things shown on the right side here in the diagram. We have the basilar artery marked as BA. We are starting from below upwards. Then it is given its terminal branch named as PCA, that is the posterior cerebral artery. The circle which is shown in the anterior portion is the internal carotid artery, which is giving anterior cerebral artery anteriorly, middle cerebral artery laterally, posterior communicating artery posteriorly, and anterior choroidal artery between middle cerebral and posterior communicating artery. Further laterally to the right side, you are seeing the segments of anterior limb, genu and posterior limb marked as AL, G and PL. The upper colored portions are the upper parts. The lower gray area is shown in gray color. Then the part arrow showing written as SLP is the sublentiform part, and the arrow showing as written as RLP is the retrolentiform part. So let us now study the blood supply. Upper parts of anterior limb, genu and posterior limb, they are all supplied by both medial and lateral striate branches of middle cerebral arteries. Of this, the posterior limb gets the largest striate branch, also known as artery of Charcot or otherwise known as artery of cerebral hemorrhage. Now this is the one which is most likely to undergo hemorrhage resulting in lesion to the internal capsule or resulting in a stroke, what is the commonest cause of stroke. Now coming to the inferior part of the anterior limb, that is supplied by recurrent branch coming from the anterior cerebral artery known as Heubner's artery. Also it is supplied by some of the perforating branches of anterior cerebral artery. Perforating, otherwise known as striate branches. Now genu is supplied by, the lower part of genu is supplied by perforating branches of anterior choroidal artery. The lower part of the posterior limb is supplied by perforating branches of internal carotid artery, anterior choroidal artery, as well as branches coming from the posterior communicating artery, which is not shown here. Now the sublentiform part is mainly supplied by the branches of anterior choroidal artery, and retrolentiform part is supplied by both anterior choroidal as well as branches coming from posterior cerebral artery. So this is the blood supply for the internal capsule. So any of these blood vessels can either undergo thrombosis, therefore resulting in an ischemic stroke, or they may undergo hemorrhage because of a burst of an aneurysm resulting in hemorrhagic stroke. Now different parts of internal capsule have different fibers. So let us see what are the component fibers in each part of the internal capsule. In the anterior limb, the ascending fibers include anterior thalamic radiation. These are the fibers which are starting from the anterior and medial nucleus of thalamus, and they are reaching the prefrontal and cingulate cortex. Descending fibers include frontopontine fibers, corticothalamic fibers, corticostriate fibers, and corticoreticular fibers. In addition to ascending and descending fibers, we also have some of the horizontally running fibers in the anterior limb which connect caudate nucleus medially and the putamen laterally. As you remember, anterior limb is between the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. So there are fibers connecting this caudate nucleus to the putamen part of the lentiform nucleus running transversely. So they are also found in the anterior limb. Functions of these fibers mainly is processing of emotions, cognition, decision making and motivation, especially the anterior thalamic radiation fibers. So any lesion to anterior limb will result in confusion, impaired attention and dysarthria. Coming to the posterior limb, the ascending fibers are seen in the posterior 1/3. They include superior thalamic radiation fibers. They are starting from ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial nucleus of thalamus to reach the somatosensory cortex. So basically it is carrying the general sensations from the contralateral half of the body. Descending fibers are seen in the anterior 2/3 of the posterior limb. They include essentially all corticospinal tract fibers. In addition, we also find other descending fibers like corticorubral, corticopontine, corticothalamic, corticostriate and corticoreticular fibers. So main function of this posterior limb is it is having corticospinal fibers. So it has got fibers which control the contralateral lower motor neurons, and also it is carrying sensation from the contralateral half of the body. Plus the corticopontine part of the fibers will also have control on the coordination of voluntary movements. So any lesion to the posterior limb will result in contralateral hemiplegia if the lesion is in the anterior 2/3, or contralateral hemianesthesia if the lesion is in the posterior 1/3. Now coming to the genu, the ascending fibers include superior thalamic radiation fibers. They are basically connecting ventral nuclei of thalamus to motor and sensory cortex. Here these are the fibers starting from ventral anterior, ventral lateral nuclei also. So they are connecting to both motor as well as sensory cortices. Descending fibers include mainly corticonuclear fibers. So they are descending from the lower part of the primary motor cortex to various cranial nerve nuclei. Also, the descending fibers include corticothalamic, corticostriate and corticoreticular fibers. So their main function is to control the movements of face and neck. So lesion to this genu area will result in dysarthria, weakness of muscles of the lower face and the tongue on the contralateral side. Now coming to the retrolentiform part, it contains the posterior thalamic radiation fibers, otherwise known as optic radiation fibers. These are the fibers which are connecting the lateral geniculate body to the primary visual cortex or area 17. It also contains those fibers which start from pulvinar of the thalamus and reach area 18, which are involved in blind sight. Descending fibers include corticothalamic fibers as well as corticopontine fibers. Now depending upon from which lobe they are starting, they are further named as paritopontine or occipitopontine fibers. The descending fibers also include occipitotectal fibers. They are starting from visual cortex and reaching the superior colliculus. So main function of this retrolentiform part is transferring visual information. So any lesion to this retrolentiform part will result in homonymous hemianopia, that is blindness in the contralateral visual field. The last part is the sublentiform part. Ascending fibers in that include inferior thalamic radiation or otherwise known as auditory radiation. They start from medial geniculate body and reach the primary auditory area, that is area 41, few of them also reaching the auditory association area, area number 42. Sublentiform part also contains Mayer's loop. Now these are actually visual fibers. They are the fibers carrying information from the lower half of the retina to the contralateral cerebral hemisphere. The descending fibers include corticothalamic, temporopontine and paritopontine fibers. So main function of the sublentiform part of the fibers include auditory information transmission and also carrying the visual information. So lesion to this will result in problems in auditory localization. Please note it does not cause deafness, because we know that both cerebral hemispheres receive input from both ears. So if one side lesion is there, it will not result in deafness, but instead there will be problem in localizing the sound. However, because of the involvement of Mayer's loop, the lesion to the sublentiform part may result in what is known as upper quadrant anopia. That is, because these fibers are carrying information from the lower half of the retina, there is blindness in the upper quadrant of the visual field. Now coming to the clinical significance, internal capsule is one of the area which is prone for cerebrovascular accidents, specifically ischemic stroke, because most of these arteries undergo hyalinosis resulting in thrombus formation or reduced blood supply, so resulting in ischemic stroke, especially involving a small area, therefore known as lacunar strokes. However, sometimes there could be an aneurysm bursting resulting in a hemorrhagic stroke. Because the fibers are very compactly packed here, so even the smallest region, if it is involved, that will result in a magnified clinical presentation. That's because that part of the fibers will be controlling much larger area on the contralateral half of the body. How to differentiate whether the lesion is in the internal capsule or the lesion is in the primary motor cortex or sensory cortex? In case there is lesion to the cortex, there will be other cortical deficits like presence of seizures, aphasia, agnosia or amnesia. Now these features will be absent if the lesion is in the internal capsule. So lesion to the internal capsule may present as pure motor strokes, that is contralateral hemiparesis or hemiplegia, or involvement of corticonuclear fibers, or it may present as ataxic hemiparesis because of the involvement of both corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers as well as corticopontine fibers. So this will result in same side hemiparesis as well as ataxia. The third way of presentation is the clumsy hand dysarthria. This will be most likely due to the lesion at the junction between genu and the posterior limb. Within the posterior limb, the corticospinal tract fibers arrangement is such that anterior fibers control the upper limb, posterior fibers control the lower limb. So the anterior fibers which are controlling the upper limb, they are lying very close to the corticonuclear fibers. So when these two group of fibers are involved, we have clumsy hand as well as dysarthria because of the involvement of corticonuclear fibers. Internal capsule is one of the commonest area having incidence of stroke, and most of the patients who come to the hospital with the features of stroke may have a problem in internal capsule. So learn these details properly because it will be important for your clinical practice. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this video. You can visit this site for other neuroanatomy videos.